Once in a while, I need to remind myself that I can believe that a man can fly. And when I do, I watch that.
And welcome back to the heart of the stories we tell. I'm Rob, the host, and this is another look deep into what makes a story, a theory on storytelling by a storyteller who believes that every story has merit. And tonight's episode is
Modern day mythology. And now, last week I was talking about horror monsters and how they've become a modern mythology. And they have. But anyone who's watched this for any length of time knows that superheroes are really where I touch on a lot. And when you think about the retellings of Superman and the slight changes here and there, and after a while, you start to look at them and you realize that every character is Superman and almost every superhero is Superman, you can see the beginning of the Herculean mythology. Now, when I was talking about horror monsters, Javon Jeff said, specifically because we were talking about why people use horror monsters for other genres, that he thought it was an interesting take. So I'm going to actually explain what I mean by a mythology. And I'm going to use superheroes, but it's the same for those horror. And he did also say that there's a reason we use them, because they're familiar and they're an easy other. And anyone else who's been watching my videos knows the others are always the enemy. The other is a psychological term, really. It is kind of like just that generic boogeyman. It's also what J.R.R. Martin calls his enemies in A Song of Fire and Ice. But okay, for those of you that don't know what I do here, I review stories as they come out, and I also tell these sorts of theory videos where I try to figure out how and why we tell stories. If that sounds interesting, click subscribe and join our crazy little fan club here as we dig into modern day mythology. And first, I think we need to talk about what mythology is and why it's different than being a legend. And I've seen this before. I've seen a great example of it. But the long and short of it is mythology is something that's told and retold and reinterpreted over and over from different points of view. You know, kind of like if you cast different people as the same role over and over again. Psychologically, it's supposed to be a way of finding out more about the writer than about the written character when you look at all of it overall. And as such, there's only a handful of characters in modern mythology that we can really say we've seen hundreds of different writers, all these different interpretations. Specifically, what I'm talking about is mimetic circulation, the ability for one person to understand a myth so well that they themselves can change the myth and add to it in the retelling. For instance, I could sit there and look at Superman and say, all right, well, the basics are X, Y, and Z. So I can write any Superman and it'll be a new cast. And yeah, it'll look a little different and there'll be differences, but we'll recognize them. Or maybe we won't. And part of that is the beauty of this. You see, Hercules isn't just one person's idea of a hero. He's thousands of people's ideas of heroes, all mashed together. And yeah, the stories don't always make sense, and the canon doesn't always fit, because sometimes these things were taken out of order. And yeah, there was mythological stuff coming back from the dead, or finding out that there was a whole trick where his wife was killed, or he himself was killed, or maybe he's a god, or maybe he's just a man. And yeah, that was all Hercules. But isn't it also Superman, and Batman, and Spider-Man? We spend so much time complaining about, oh, they're rebooting this series again so quickly. And yeah, maybe we don't need them rebooted quite so quickly. But realistically, isn't there a benefit to looking at the mythology of Superman? Being able to look at and say, hey, which version of Superman do you relate to best? And why? What minor changes over his almost 100 years change? And when they do you relate more to an angry Supergirl? Or do you relate more to a goody two-shoes Supergirl? Do you relate to Superman better when he's just a four-color hero? Or maybe You need him, not to be a man at all, to relate. And maybe we all need a little bit of the Man of Tomorrow in our world. When Superman started out, when those two writers sat down and created him, they could not possibly have imagined what was going to happen, and they could not possibly have written him in such a way that would make him a myth. What happened is, by accident. See, way back when, mythology was created because it was all passed by word of mouth. So you heard the story from your uncle, and then you told the story to your grandson. And when you told the story, you made slight changes, sometimes on purpose, sometimes reflexively. And then when they heard it, they interpreted it different. So when they passed it down, so these stories morphed. And then there were all of these different stories because it morphed from one line to the next line to the next line. And as such, they morph differently. So where, hey, everyone in this city knows this story, but everyone in that city knows that story. And they're the same story, more or less, but slightly different because they morphed over time. We can't have that nowadays. Well, we could, but what we have instead is one writer created Superman, and, well, two, and then other writers inherited them. Now, horror monsters specifically became part of our modern mythology because they were part of something called free use. Because the statute of limitations expired on their ability to be patented. No one owns the copyright on them. The mouse will never give up any of it, and as such, people like Superman and Batman end up locked down as well. No one will ever own Superman in the free use. Instead, we get writer after writer after writer, and as they do, what they're writing, what they're doing, is all for DC, or Warner Brothers more specifically. And as they do it, they are expanding, contracting, changing. Right now, the current writer is Brian Michael Bendis, and I'm not reading it because I'm not happy with some of the changes he made. But there are other writers that are writing him as well, on TV shows like Supergirl, or in the movies. And at differing levels, I am enjoying or not enjoying those. You can see my other reviews to look more in-depthly at him. But at the end of the day, what are the basic principles of Superman? Well, some people might say it's his powers. Others might say it's the character. In fact, one of the big debates in Superman mythology is, who's the real man? Is he Clark Kent pretending to be Superman to hide who he is so that he can help people? Or is he Superman trying to pretend to be Clark Kent to hide? Or is he Kal-El, something greater than both Clark Kent and Superman, and both are disguises? And you yourself have to answer that for you. Because you see, at the end of the day, there are yes answers to all three, and there are no answers to all three. Because at the end of the day, this mythology is pick and choose. Because there's so many different versions of it. You get to pick out the one that affects you the most. And like I said before, if anything, it's a reflection of the writer. Well, if you're writing that the powers aren't that important, it's the heart that matters, then maybe that's because you personally want to believe in that heart. Or if you kill him and have 4 different people try to take up his legacy, and you're trying to show that anyone can rise to be Superman, a man of steel, a man of tomorrow, maybe that says something about you. Or maybe somewhere in between. Maybe George Reeves, Christopher Reeves, Brandon Roth, maybe they're all showcasing a slightly different variation on the same idea. And I'll tell you right now, my favorite Superman is always probably going to be the one that died fighting Doomsday and came back. And I don't mean the reign of the Superman necessarily, but just overall. And I really loved him married to Lois and them having a son. And that's part of what I don't like about what Brian Michael Bendis did. And it doesn't make your choice any different. Maybe you don't like him married to Lois. Maybe you actually like something different. There's a whole multiverse of Supermen out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's not just Superman. It's not just horror monsters. maybe we have a few mythologies running right now, but not as many as you might think or hope for. And as Jovan said, at the end of the day, there's a certain acceptance of those guys over there, those others, they're different. So we don't need just powers, though. See, Batman is just as much a mythology as Superman. Every different variation, every different one of him. Whether you like the Arkham Knight, or the current Batman in the movies, or the Last Knight, or the time that he was played by George Clooney. Really, anyone? George Clooney your favorite? Let me know in the comment section if anyone thinks George Clooney is their favorite. And it's not just heroes that get this either. There are plenty of villains, or supporting cast members, or whatever, that we have multiple versions of, that are different, and that you might find one to be your favorite, and the others are, pale imitations. And of course, the word mythology really makes you think about a different type of character, though, doesn't it? Specifically the mythos. And I often wonder, if people weren't still writing about Cthulhu, if people weren't still writing about Superman or Batman, would these stories still be being told by word of mouth? But like I said up top, a certain amount of this is also a window into the eyes of the writer. And so to end this out, I want to talk about some of Superman's powers. And yes, he's had some ridiculous ones, like throw cellophane shields, or that time that they gave him the ability to see souls. But very specifically, it is a sight-based one I want to talk about, because that is one of the ones that I think really gets in depth and showcases exactly what I mean by Superman as mythology. I want to talk X-ray vision. The idea of being able to see through anything except for lead is a pretty ingenious power set. It gives him quite a bit of detective capability, but it also has some pervy thought processes behind it. And if you really think about it, I mean, really, the ability to see through clothing has some connotations to it. And you know what? If you're thinking about the scene I think you're thinking about Superman Returns, when he became Super Stalker. But I want you to think that somewhere a writer thought that through. What would I do if I had X-ray vision? Well, what would Superman do? And in a room full of writers and people who were editing and people who were seeing the script ahead of time, no one said, hey, Superman shouldn't be peeping Tom on Lois and her new boyfriend because that's kind of creepy. But I also want to talk for a second about the other type of connotation. Remember, the very first movie, the one I love so much, the one that makes you believe a man can fly, had Lois ask, can you see what color my underwear is? And the fact that Superman likes pink. I don't think I personally would have written either of those scenes that way. But someone did, because in their mythology, in their thought process, that's what Superman would do. In Smallville, there was a really great thing where his x-rays came on and he saw the bones and muscle structure of his best friend and almost fell. And in the aftermath of being able to realize he could see and hear anything he wanted, he asked his mother, what should I do? And her advice to him was pretty great. Learn not to look. Learn to close your eyes. Because at the end of the day, it could be a blessing and a curse. But talking about pervy, on the other hand, Lois and Clark has a great example of it too. Just not with Superman. See, in that case, they gave his powers to another person by doing a power swap thing. And once they did that, they had a whole thing where he was sitting outside a building eating popcorn, and Superman landed to talk to him. And then he asked, why are we sitting here anyway? And he looked over, and because there was a women's gym shower across the street. Ugh. At least that was not Superman doing it. It was just the power set being used. And all of these are examples of writers thinking up on their own how they would use it, how they think Superman would use it. And it showcases how they think and what they think about Superman. And as such, teaches us a little bit about what they're thinking and how they're thinking. So I want everyone to think, if you got a chance to be a storyteller and get to play in someone else's sandbox for a while, if you got to slightly retweak one of these characters and make them your own, how would you do it? And not necessarily just one of the ones I talked about today, Doctor Who, Superman, Batman, any of these modern mythologies. And here's why. Because about a year ago, I started a fan pitch idea for one of my things where I said DC Abstract, and I started with a whole Batman line of things where I was going to recreate the DC universe as my pitch for how I would do it. And I said up next was the aliens and Superman, and I never quite got around to it. So in 2 weeks, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about that. Up on my Patreon, I've already had some posts about it. But for now, let me know down below, what do you think of our modern mythology? Do you agree with me that horror movies and comic books are mostly it? And of course, we've reached that part of the video where I ask you to like, share, and subscribe, because, well, I'm a YouTuber and I do those things. And a big shout out thank you to my Patreons out there that are helping make all of this possible. However, I recognize not everyone can help me out financially. You can help me out content-wise. Make sure and leave a comment. Talk to me about what you think about these, as we try to gather up all of our thoughts, take apart the story, think a little more into it, and get to the heart of the stories we tell. I hope you have a good night, and thanks for watching.